So what is COP26? It's the 26th Conference of the Parties under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So it's basically an annual meeting, which should have happened last year. So we had a year's gap because of the pandemic. And that's a meeting of the parties to the Convention on Climate Change, which is 197 nations. Now the US are back in it. And it's about the global response to climate change. So it's focused on the political solution and the acknowledgement that actually, we cannot tackle the global challenge of climate change without global cooperation. You could ask why we haven't already achieved that, given there have been 25 of them. So the last one in 2019 in Madrid was COP25, and that's because this is so complex. Every nation is deeply invested in tackling climate change because it will come back and bite them if we don't. But everyone has differentiated responsibilities for those emissions. So we've now just had COP26. We will have many more COPs, and we need them because of the urgency and because of the complexity. So Scotland's commitments on climate change they've been called world leading. I'd say they're definitely up there if we look at the benchmark across all what other nations have committed to. So the headline commitment for Scotland is to get to net zero by 2045. So that's getting to a stage where our unavoidable emissions, which hopefully will be pretty small, but will come from things like healthcare, from hopefully limited amount of aviation and food production, do they're balanced by sequestration of some sort or another. So 2045 is earlier than most nations. We've also got probably one of the most ambitious targets for 2030, which is crucial. I mean, this is a decade of action for climate change and actually keeping 1.5 alive in the Paris Agreement. So our commitment in Scotland, and this is legally binding, is to reduce emissions by 75% by 2030. We've reduced them by about 50% so far, just over. So that's an awful long way to go. It's very robust in terms of not relying on market offsets. It's really taking the action here domestically in terms of cutting emissions. And it has at its core, which is crucial, I think, is just transition principles. Is doing this in a way where actually we realise those emission reductions in the context of people's well-being, of their livelihoods, of not making the mistakes of the past, like we saw with the end of coal effectively in Scotland in the 80s and 90s. That was great in terms of carbon, apart from a lot of the industry going overseas, but disastrous in terms of people's livelihoods, the scarring that happened in terms of opportunities for communities across Scotland. So I'm not a spokesperson for the government or for any of the parliamentary parties, but we're ahead of the game in terms of our targets and our actions.
I'm a member of Living Wren. I'm active in the Edinburgh Leith branch of Living Wren. I've been a member for about 3 years. Living Wren is a tenants union. We're democratically organised. We're run by members for members. We organise and represent our members in the private and social rented sector. We fight for safe, secure and affordable housing for everyone. We're not affiliated to any political party. We're associated to Acorn International, which is an organisation which helps develop community groups around the world. As a union, we are committed to the provision of high quality, green and affordable housing for all, and to fighting climate change across all our campaigns. Living Wren believes that there is a need to replace energy provision in homes away from fossil fuels, and that this transition could unlock huge potential for tenants, for the Scottish economy and the environment. Firstly, the quality of Scotland's housing stock is among the lowest in Western Europe. Housing and climate change are linked in as much as that damage from extreme weather already affects people's housing and will do so with increasing frequency. Consequences of climate change induce damage to housing, increased risk of homelessness, as well as greater risk of mental and physical ill health. And this is aside from any monetary damage. In order to ensure that our housing is resistant to climate change-induced damages, we need to make sure that the housing stock can withstand increasingly severe weather. Specifically, we need to make sure that the housing stock can withstand increased heat, increased rainfall and winds, and increased periods of cold as well. In the community where I live and I'm a member in Leith, we face a lot of problems surrounding air pollution. Specifically, the neighbourhood around Salamander Street is one of the most polluted in Scotland and has extremely high levels of particle pollution. Salamander Street, for the past 6 months, has on average breached legal limits on particle pollution. In terms of housing, Scotland is not a world leader in its response to climate change. Our housing stock is among one of the oldest in the world, resulting from that also one of the worst insulated in Western Europe. The housing stock has been deteriorating in condition for a long period now.
ECCI stands for Edinburgh Climate Change Institute. We do a lot of work in terms of supporting the evidence base for climate action. So linking together our researchers, our academics, but also our students with policymakers, with businesses to actually make sure that that flow of evidence is there. We hear a lot from politicians in particular about, all right, this is evidence-based policy making, but actually that's only as good as the evidence that underpins it. So a key role for us is we host Climate Exchange. So Climate Exchange provides the evidence base for all of the climate policy here in Scotland. We host Sustainable Scotland Network, so they do a similar job for all local authorities and public bodies who are really, I guess, really key in terms of actually realising climate action on the ground and at those kind of local scales. We work a lot with the City Council, so we have projects with them around, I guess, giving them advice, working with them as a partner, because we're a big institution in Edinburgh. They've got a target of 2030 for net zero as a city. They can't do that without the university, but actually we've been proactive. So ECCI, the Climate Change Institute, we sit on the Climate Commission, which advises the City Council, but also we're hopefully a valued and trusted partner in terms of how to actually make that transition to zero emissions. My favourite bit though, and I think the thing that we do really effectively, and the room I'm sat in now is our training and skills room, and the amount of fun I've had in here I just couldn't sum up in words, because we do a lot of teaching and working with students, lots of dissertation projects, and that is where we have the biggest impact as a university, but as ECCI too, is the kind of graduates from our programs, the alumni networks that we have, the kind of, I guess, the understanding of climate change, not from a climate science point of view only, which is where I come from, but combining that with policy, with business, with economics, being able to speak the languages of climate change. Going to COP26 in these last couple of weeks, one of the joys for me was seeing our graduates there, and they were negotiating key parts of the Paris Agreement, getting great results, and we had a small part to play in that because they studied here at Edinburgh. Aligned to that, just to mention in terms of the teaching, education, learning, is we have a suite of open access climate courses that ECCI leads on for the university. I love that, I guess, because the content comes from our alumni and our students, so they make these courses. So all of these courses are bespoke for the nations that we work with, and because they're open access, they're available to anyone, to teachers who want to use it for their lessons. They're open to people who are thinking, why is climate change relevant to me, if they're school leavers and they can see what they can do about it. They're open to all of our students in the university, but any university, any college, any school, anyone in the world. And that's part of our role as a university, why I love this place, why I believe in it so much, is that we're about cheesily doing good for the world, and we do that through our graduates, through our students, through our staff, and we also do that through making resources freely available and helping build capacity locally but globally as well. If you think about all the challenges which we face in the 21st century, but actually the challenges we faced for centuries in terms of human society, where we've had no access to education or unequal access to education, that has hindered progress, it's hindered development, it's hindered tackling these issues. COVID just being one example of many. Climate change is so fundamentally a threat to our way of life, to the futures of all of us, but for generations to come. Education allows us to understand the solutions. Without education, we're in a situation where we could not have delivered the progress we've made so far, and that's not enough. But without education, we cannot unlock that potential, which is massive around the world. Those 7.5 billion people, they are all potential actors in delivering a safer climate future, but that only comes with knowledge, with access to that knowledge being universal, and with that education at all levels. The success of COP26, has it been a delivery COP? Do I think it's been successful? So it's delivered in part, and I suppose if I'm often accused of being an over-optimist, and going into COP26, one of the key deliveries that I was hoping for, that I think everyone was hoping for, was a big closing of the gap towards the 1.5 degree target in terms of those commitments from nations. And that was not delivered. There was a bit of a closing of the gap, but nowhere near enough. So we're still on track for what would be devastating levels of warming and climate change impacts. I've got a big caveat on that, and that I'd say it was a successful COP in the main. And my main reason for saying that is that although the national commitments don't add up to 1.5, we had agreement from all the nations that not enough was happening, recognition from the science, from Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that actually 2 degrees is way too much, and 1.5 needs to be the target, not just an ambition, that needs to be delivered by international action. And probably one of the best outcomes, which hasn't been extensively covered, or as extensively covered about COP, was about the Paris rulebook. So one of the things we saw in terms of the COP26 agreement, the Glasgow Compact, was a lot of discussion about, the language was watered down in terms of phasing down rather than phasing out coal, for instance. We saw a lot of frustration about there not being a clear finance mechanism for loss and damage, so that the impacts of climate change, which are already happening, that adaptation can't avoid, people are already suffering, and so there's a lot of frustration around those. If we had a scenario where we had got phase out coal, and there's going to be a finance mechanism for loss and damage and more money for adaptation, there is more commitment to funding for adaptation, but if we got much more in terms of the overt successes that the media might report, then actually that could have all been completely undermined by the rule book being weak or not agreed. So that was a big success. And as a bit of a self-confessed climate geek, the numbers really matter, and how robust the emission reductions are. What counts is what the atmosphere sees, right? And so the rule book is fundamental to making sure that the rhetoric actually lives up to the atmosphere seeing less CO2 and other greenhouse gases. And I think we did see a real step forward in terms of that rule book. So for me, I'm counting it as a success on that front. Lots of reservations about the speed of action, the flow of finance, not just the loss and damage, but adaptation more generally. Definitely it didn't tick all the boxes, but it ticks a crucial one, which is the rules that we play this. It's not a game, is it? It's how we fight this war with climate. Actually, we've now got a playbook which is robust.
The message again that after COP26, unfortunately, we see an enormous gap between the countries' pledges and what we need for the targets of the Paris Agreement, the 1.5 degrees Celsius as global temperature. And scientists have warned that the current pledges will lead us to a 2.4 degrees Celsius trajectory by the end of the century. When countries form coalitions, they get together and they tie their hands to reduce their emissions jointly. So in this spirit, with my co-authors, we have a recent research paper that we try to model the climate coalition formation. So I'd like to first talk about this model, this research paper, and then I'd like to talk about a few policy messages out of it. So we try to capture broader incentives of policymakers in contrast to the common models that are used in the literature. And we use game theoretic approaches to do so. So we assume that policymakers take into account the long-run consequences of their decision-making, climate decisions, on their growth, on their macroeconomies, on their saving decisions, on their investment, on the management of their fossil fuel resources. And we assume these policymakers rationally and strategically, they take into account the consequences of their decision-making on climate coalitions and climate policies on decisions of other countries. We also allow for heterogeneity across countries. So our model captures how countries are developed, or if they are resource rich, if they are major polluters, if they are high-tech in adaptation and developing green technologies. In a nutshell, we predict that the number of signatories of climate coalitions follow Fibonacci numbers. So the Fibonacci numbers are a sequence of numbers that each element is some of the preceding three elements. They belong to the family of Fibonacci numbers. You might have heard that they tend to pop up in the natural world whenever there is a need for an efficient way of packing elements together, like the number of petals of flowers, number of bracts of pine cones, and so on. So the reason that having more coalitions can help is that each of these coalitions, they're contributing something. At the moment, the current structure in climate negotiations is just having one single coalition, and others are free riding. You know, there are enormous gains of being free rider next to a large coalition, right? So if there are only 90 signatories in the Treaty of Reducing Methane, then the remainder, all other countries, are free riding. So what is the policy message out of this? So I would say there are three main messages. First, allowing for multiple coalitions. Both in academic literature and in practice, we see too much emphasis on formation of a single climate coalition. While we see it may not be ambitious enough, it might be fragile. The Paris Agreement is an example of a single climate coalition. So we suggest why not allowing for multiple? If one coalition is not stable, then allowing for two coalitions. COP26, they came up with several treaties, and for each treaty, for example, the Treaty of Reducing Methane or phasing out coal, for example. So the treaty for methane has 90 signatories, and the remaining countries are free riding. So this is what we suggest, allowing for multiple coalitions here can help, because all these coalitions would set some target, and it makes the whole structure more stable. The second policy message is that large coalitions can be stable. And like, for example, our model predicts if we have 195 countries, then 195 is not a Fibonacci number, so we won't have a grand coalition, but still we have like the largest integer smaller than 195, which is a Fibonacci number, is 149. And then the remainder should be broken down in the same way. So our prediction is, in the model, is there will be three coalitions, and with 149, 44, and 2 signatories. And each of them are contributing. So the world is very heterogeneous. When we talk about less developed countries, but some of them are affected by climate disasters more severely than others. So there's a trade-off of like joining a climate coalition and tying their hands, coming into a binding agreement with the most developed countries in the world, they may see that maybe the main reason that they are suffering from this climate disasters is because of the emissions that over the last 200 years the most developed countries have created. So there are a lot of tension and trade-offs going on, and there is, although an acceptance and a willingness to support the underdeveloped countries in that, and there has been a lot of discussions on Paris Plus because it has all shortcomings to improve it, in the sense of improving the finance from developed countries to developing countries. But at the moment, the pledges are not ambitious, and we, as I said, there is such a breakdown of trust that we see number of signatories in a lot of these treaties is fewer than what we had under the Paris Agreement.